Right. So Ben and I run From the Page, which hopefully you've heard of. It's a crowdsourcing platform that's used by libraries, archives, museums, and documentary editors. We run webinars every month, and they often involve guest speakers who run projects on the platform, sometimes guest speakers who run projects on other platforms. And sometimes it's Ben and I talking about the types of things you can do with crowdsourcing, or kind of the soft skills you need to run crowdsourcing projects. You know, kind of it varies what we talk about. Sometimes we do a deep dive into a feature like ledger and spreadsheet transcription. If you could drop into the chat, we have another webinar coming up in a month. That's we're calling it Everything You Can Do with Crowdsourcing. And it's a lot of case studies and examples of different types of projects that people are doing and how they're applying both the technical features and the strategies of crowdsourcing to solve different types of problems. Today, we're super, super excited because instead of us talking, we've invited some of our friends to come speak about their projects. Can I hand it over to you?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and get started. So we are joined today by Lindsey Peterson and Susannah Ural from the Civil War and Reconstruction Governors of Mississippi Project, by Laura Baker at the Julian Bond Papers, and by Jack McKivigan and Sue Perdue at the Frederick Douglass Papers. And so all of these have a focus on Black history, so we thought that this would be really appropriate for Black History Month. This is also pretty exciting for us because it's the first time that we've had a group of scholarly editors present, as opposed to archivists or librarians. So this is going to be kind of exciting. All of these projects have been funded by the NHPRC, which is the National Historic Publications and Records Commission. And they've provided a lot of leadership and advice, I know, as well as funding. So we're going to start by asking each presenter, and I think we're just going to start in the order that I introduced them, with Mississippi, followed by Bond, followed by Douglass, to spend just a couple of minutes, for those who are not familiar, describing the subject of their edition.
Sure. Thanks. It's good to see some kind of old friends who helped me enter this field a number of years ago. So I'm glad to be here. And Ben and Sarah, thanks for hosting this. So the Civil War and Reconstruction Governors of Mississippi Project features Civil War and Reconstruction era documents from Mississippians of all backgrounds, speaking through we have about a total of about 20,000 documents that span 9 governors' administrations from the period of 1859, so kind of late antebellum, early secession crisis, through 1882. We did that purposely. The last governor comes into office right at the end of Reconstruction in 1876. And, you know, by getting his full and unusually long term, it lets us kind of watch the collapse of Reconstruction and the beginnings of the Jim Crow South. These are freely available online at CWRGM.org. And, you know, the thing I think to emphasize the most about this is in the 19th century, because Americans tended to write their governors about everything you can possibly imagine. It's usually a complaint. The data is skewed in that direction. Nobody writes into the governor saying you're doing a great job. But because it's almost like the way people use social media today. So you really get to hear from people. Even illiterate people would have someone write on their behalf. So you get to hear from people who traditionally you cannot. And that's one of the reasons that Lindsey and I really wanted to make these records, and our partners in the state wanted to make these records be freely available online.
Fantastic. Thank you. Laura, could you describe Julian Bond and the Bond Papers?
Sure. I am Laura Baker. I'm the managing editor of the Julian Bond Papers, and we are a very new project. Julian Bond was a civil rights icon. He started his civil rights activism when he was 20 years old at Morehouse in 1960, and he was a founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he started his activism being part of the sit-in movement. Of course, SNCC went on to do a whole lot of things in the 60s. And Julian Bond became the communications director for that organization. Then he became a Georgia legislator, and he filled that role for 21 years. And then he ended his career with 20 years of teaching, including teaching at the University of Virginia. And he left all of his papers in the University of Virginia's collection. So we have, because he started when he was 20 and he was a communications director, meaning he wrote every single press release, newspaper article, everything for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as well as for Atlanta newspapers. And he was the press contact for much of the civil rights movement, for the student movement. And he worked very closely with John Lewis. That means that we have 50 years of papers, because he started when he was 20 and he gave his last speech 3 months before he died at the age of 75. So we have a tremendous amount of content, and it's only just starting to be worked with. So it's rich and wonderful, and I'm incredibly lucky to be working on this project. We're starting with his speeches, and so we have, I think, about 300 to 400 of his speeches that we'll be publishing first, and they start from 1968 and go all the way through the 2000s. So the content is rich and eminently relevant to everything going on right now.
Thank you. Jack or Sue, can you introduce us to Frederick Douglass and the Frederick Douglass papers? Jack, you are muted. There we go.
Jack Kaufman-McKivigan. I'm the editor of the Frederick Douglass papers. This project got started as a traditional print scholarly edition in 1973. And we published volumes. We're still in the process of publishing a 15-volume traditional print edition with Yale University Press. We're about ready to submit our 13th volume. So you can see we're coming to the end of a very long tunnel. And so 5 or 6 years ago, I began working with Sue Perdue, maybe it's longer than that, Sue, when I think back, on a digital edition. And so the print edition was set up in 4 different series. We had the speech volumes, the autobiography volumes, the correspondence volumes, and then the other materials. We have quite a lot of editorials and other miscellaneous journalism by Frederick Douglass. The goal of our digital edition is to supplement the documents that we have published in book form online, because the necessity of a print edition is to be highly selective. We have thousands of speeches, letters, and editorials to choose from. So now with a digital edition, we have no boundaries. We can publish everything about Frederick Douglass as long as we want to. All right, so that's the expansive goals of the Frederick Douglass papers.
Great.
One of the questions that I wanted to ask, I feel like a lot of the libraries and archives that we work with, they have the collections in their possession, they've digitized them, and then they're working on transcribing those things. I gather from my limited exposure that the world of documentary editing is often not so fortunate. So I wondered if you could each explain a bit about where your documents are and what kind of formats they're in. Maybe we can just go in reverse and start with Jack, and then Laura and Susannah and Lindsey.
Yes, Douglass's materials are international. We did a very extensive search in the 70s and then redid it in the 90s to find correspondence, for example, from all over the world. Finding his speeches is a kind of a difficult process, because we have to follow the trail of where he was announced he was going to speak, find if there's any published reports of those speeches, and then reproduce them. Autobiographies, it's easy. We have them. Newspapers, relatively easy, except for a fire in 1870 that burned some of the only copies. There's no surviving copies of some of Frederick Douglass's editorials. So we depending on the type of document, there's quite a lot of searching for a usable text to start with.
Laura?
So the largest collection is Julian Bond's personal collection. He left that to Special Collections at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and it contains 47,000 items according to the finding aid. 47,000 items. So the status is that they are in boxes in the basement of Special Collections in Charlottesville. Because it's so new, we're just opening the folders. A couple public print editions of books are just starting to come out from popular presses. There's no, we're just opening these folders, so we're not reprinting anything. Julian Bond's widow published a beautiful compilation of Bond's lectures. So that is out. But for the most part, we're just starting. There are handwritten, typed speeches, there are letters, there are videos, and we are moving through as quickly as we can, but it will take a long time. There are other Julian Bond documents in the world associated with his work in activist groups, and they are in other collections, but they don't match the scale of what we have. And we will be doing a document search sometime in the next 3 years to start that process. But right now we're just opening folders.
Lindsey and Susannah?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take this one. So it's kind of ironically fortunate in the sense of when the Mississippi State Archives, they're called the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, was founded in the very early beginning of the 20th century. One of their earliest missions was to gather all Confederate records that they could, particularly those of the governors. In many ways, this was a kind of a lost cause effort to glorify the Confederacy, to kind of gather up this history and to be saved and treasured. But we're very grateful in many ways that they did, because, if you know anything about governor's records, what they are, the governors are in there, but mainly what you're hearing from are just thousands and thousands of people who are not the governors, who are not the decision makers. And as we've been getting into these Reconstruction era records, you're hearing increasingly from freed peoples as they become citizens. You're watching the very kind of conscious destruction of fundamental civil rights, particularly for African Americans. So the state insisted on gathering all of these governors' records together very early. So we're fortunate in the sense that that was already done. When a woman, an archivist by the name of Lisa Jones, and I went up to Jackson and sat down with the Department of Archives and History and asked them, what do you think about trying to do something like this? So we're really a partnership between the state archives, the Mississippi Digital Library, which is basically an online archival library collection for just repositories all across the state who want to make their collections available online, freely available online. And the University of Southern Mississippi's history program, which works on a lot of these records. They are almost all handwritten and in cursive. We do get the forms that are pre-printed and typed like that, but even there, you're going to have a lot of handwriting. So as we hire, we have a wonderful student research team, and as we hire students, one of the things we have to make sure of is you can not only read cursive, but I mean really read cursive. And this is where later Lindsey we'll be talking about this, about where volunteers can be critically important. So, but we are very, very fortunate in the sense that all of these records were already gathered. Most of them already at least had a calendar, kind of basic metadata written for them. Some of them did not. And that we really were able to work with the state archives that honestly had already started digitizing the first governor's records, and was we've just had really enthusiastic partners all the way. And as all of us I know will attest, you cannot do this without partnerships. These projects are just too big.
Great. Well, that might be a good jumping off point. The next question I kind of wanted to ask was what role crowdsourcing plays, what role the public plays in these projects. And why don't we go back in reverse and start with Lindsey and Susannah, and then Laura, and then the Douglas papers.
Yeah, so all of our crowdsourcing is predominantly done through From the Page. And one of the things I always find surprising is that we don't actually have a huge group of volunteers that transcribe our documents. There's about 3 solid volunteers, but they do so much of our transcription and they're so active on the website that they're able to do almost all of our drafting, which is fantastic because their cursive reading skills are much better than undergraduate students as well. So they do the bulk of our crowdsourcing, and then our research team is aimed towards reviewing their work and adding annotation, which we'll talk about later. But one of the cool things that CWRGM's been able to do recently is establish some really strong relationships with some of the volunteers that transcribe our documents. So for example, Dee Dee Baldwin just wrote a blog post, which should be available for us soon. And so she knows our documents in our collection before almost anybody does, because she's drafted so many, especially the Reconstruction Era documents. And she was able to take those documents that pertain to African-American history and these early Reconstruction efforts and kind of acts of citizenship and write a really fantastic blog post with it. And so crowdsourcing can be kind of a cool way for people to publish materials and to volunteer as part of tenure track applications and things like that as well. But it doesn't actually require huge numbers of people. Like I said, we usually have about 3 and they do so much of our work.
That's great. Yeah, that's what we have often observed in many of these projects.
And I noticed that Dee Dee Baldwin is on this webinar,
Yeah.
so you can call it out there, Dee Dee. Laura?
Our project is tremendously grateful to our From the Page volunteers because because we have so much content and we're such an early project, our funding comes entirely from the NHPRC. So we only have 1 full-time staff member. We have other editors on the project, but they all have other jobs. And so we don't want this content to take 45 years to get into the world. And so our From the Page volunteers are very enthusiastic and active, and they help us both get the raw transcriptions that we need to actually move this content through, but they also are helping us make sure that this content can get out into the world as quickly as possible in any form. So, interacting, when you read any of Julian Bond's speeches, they're just incredible. They seem as though they were written yesterday. And so it's really important to get this information out. Our volunteers notice how wonderful the content is and want to interact with it. We also were fortunate, our director, who is Professor Deborah McDowell, started public events in 2018. We had a public transcribe-a-thon in Charlottesville that was also connected online to From the Page, so people could contribute anywhere. And then we had a second one in 2019, and that recruited quite a few volunteers who have stayed with us and have very clearly enabled notifications for when new content is uploaded. And in fact, we had I was doing some test content one time in the middle of the night and I fell asleep and I woke up and that content was transcribed. So we're extremely grateful while we're building our project and attracting other funding to have the ability to get Bond's words just available somewhere. And then we'll talk later about the rest of our process, but it's an incredible source of sharing for this content.
What we love, I think, about documentary editions is they have so much more of a public history mission than sometimes your more traditional academic research work.
Jack, Sue, do y'all want to talk about crowdsourcing and the Douglas papers?
Yeah, let me handle that. So, traditionally, as I told you earlier, we start as a print edition, and traditionally we had staff do all of this transcription work. But when we moved into this digital expansive phase, that just proved completely impractical due to the large number of items we had to transcribe. And so this is when Sue guided us to Sarah and Ben, and we began our work on From the Page. And there's a lot of effort required on both, to transfer documents to you guys to upload to, but you've been the people that have really brought us the transcribers and recruited people who have accomplished an enormous amount of work, which was way beyond the scale that we would have probably ever been able to do, or certainly in any reasonable time frame do, from office staff or editors. So we're in the debt of all the volunteer transcribers that you crowdsourcing has brought to the project.
Volunteers are absolutely amazing. One of the questions I wanted to ask next was about something that I feel like is another difference between the scholarly editing projects that we work with and the library and archive projects, some of the library and archive projects that we work with, which is what you do after the transcriptions have been made, after someone is transcribed. And I wonder if we could go back in reverse and start with the Douglas papers and hear a little bit about the kinds of annotations, the kinds of indexing, the kinds of further processing that you're doing.
Promise I let Sue handle this one.
I'll turn my video on and say hello to everybody. As Jack observed, we've kind of created a hybrid version of the project within From the Page, and From the Page is sort of a holding space for the documents. Many documents have already been published and already have annotations, so the workflow for those documents is very different from original transcription. In that case, that means kind of encoding the annotation that already exists within the document. And that tends to be work that's isolated to people with project expertise. So we use features in From the Page, the sets, to isolate those documents and set up a workflow. Thanks to the Mississippi project for that idea. But for newly transcribed documents, they will not be annotated, likely. But the enriched metadata that we add, the author recipient, the date, the repository, and eventually the linking of the names within documents to the entities within From the Page will provide, in my mind, almost as fully annotated a version as you would get in a published document. So again, in my mind, and I think most of us agree with this notion, that metadata is a form of annotation.
Interesting.
Yes.
That is interesting.
Yeah. Laura, can you tell us about your process?
Sure. Our work will go through quite a few stages. The initial one is in From the Page, but then all of the additional historical context and annotation and linking will happen somewhere else, which I think we'll talk about in a separate question. But first, we actually do process the raw transcriptions quite a bit because there's a lot of formatting involved, especially because we're working with speeches. There are a lot of elements of formatting that need review. So for instance, Bond very often wrote his speeches in all caps because it's easier to read out loud. And so there's a lot of review that goes into removing those all caps or determining when we shouldn't remove all of those caps. And so looking at the documents for online consumption versus the ways they were produced originally. So we do that kind of process even just for our early access or raw publication. So there's quite a bit of work that goes just to get a raw transcription into our system so that it's usable for researchers, for search purposes and all of that. And then in the coming years, we are going to go back and do annotation, names linking, historical context. And there's quite a bit of work to do there as well, because you know, just for example, it's not only identifying the historical people that are mentioned or topics that are mentioned within the content, but there's also a whole world of context to be described within the collection. So for example, a very simple thing is that Julian Bond's speeches share a lot of content. He used sort of templates, and we have a lot of speeches where he took an old speech and then scribbled on it and changed things. So you can see he's reusing content. But then there are a lot of speeches where you can't see that. They'll just be a typed page, but because I've read all of these words, I know that these sections and these sections are from other places. And there's a lot of interesting work that you can sort of see if he's speaking to public officials, he might use a certain phrase. If he's speaking to Black college students, he might use a different phrase for the same thing. So there's quite a bit of work that we would like to provide that is beyond just identifying historic figures and things like that. And so that's in our second annotated release stage. So we're doing it all in phases, kind of like the Founders Online project, if anyone is familiar with that.
Okay, cool. Lindsey, Susannah, do you want to describe the annotation work that your project's doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned before, a bunch of our drafting gets done by volunteers, and they have kind of a stripped down version of the formatting that gets done. But then all of our documents get taken into a private folder from then on, and they go through 2 stages of review based on our more extensive formatting. And at that stage is when we start our annotation. So we use From the Pages subject tag features, which I absolutely love and could talk about for like days. And we use a controlled vocabulary to 8 different categories for names, places. Our favorite category is social identifiers, although I'm really also partial to the vital statistics category. And we link a controlled vocabulary to the terminology that appears in the documents. Then one of the coolest things about that is it basically generates, you know, an early kind of form of annotation through indexes. And then we're able to, based on the kind of the description in that link box that From the Page creates, we're able to write contextual annotations that will apply to all instances of that vocabulary in the collection. So you have to be a little bit careful because your annotation isn't specific to one letter per se, it's specific to that term at large, but it allows us to annotate a lot of things like counties in Mississippi fairly quickly, where we can describe when they're established, where, if they change names, and we can give a little bit of that context. And we're kind of, we're overlapping our phases. So as we transcribe, we subject tag. We also have an annotation team working at the same time. And one of the coolest things about it too is the subject team, they go quickly, right? If they don't know the name of a person in a doc, they tag it so we can find it later, maybe Peterson, unknown. But the annotation team, as they research it, they can find that actually that person is, you know, Beth Peterson, and go in and we can update that subject tag as we go too. So they kind of feed into one another and help, you know, our letters help write things for the annotations, and our annotations help fix subject tags as we go. It means we have to deal with, you know, sometimes missing information or errors, but it's really kind of a cool process as we go. So that's how we've been doing our annotating. I would say in terms of crowdsourcing, one of the coolest things we've done too is, again, our volunteers have been fantastic. They will add things. I hate calling you again, Dee Dee, but has this amazing website, Against All Odds, at muchado.net, and it's all about the first Black legislators in Mississippi. And Dee Dee's been able to link and provide pages to that. And so we're actually going to pull in that website as one of the places that we pull information from when writing annotation. So it brings kind of traffic to that website, and it helps us find information. And it's from a reputable place because we can't just take, you know, information from anywhere to write our annotations. And so we have this amazing source that we can use for our researchers that's freely available, and it's kind of inform those annotations.
Well, that actually brings us, I think, you know, describing this flow and this process brings us very nicely to the next question, which is, you know, once you've done this work, where is it housed? A lot of libraries and archives are simply kind of bringing the material back into their digital library systems to enable full text search or things like that. Scholarly editions are published, right? So how does that work? And we could start with the Mississippi example and go from there.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, we spent a lot of time talking about this as we developed the project. We talked with a lot of other existing digital editions to see, okay, how's it going for you? If you could change it, what would you do differently? One of our options is that all of the digitization takes place at the state archives. Then they send those document files to Mississippi Digital Library. So the images of all of our digitized documents are at Mississippi Digital Library. That's where it's housed. That's where the metadata, the images do not go up until we have reviewed, verified metadata for each one of these documents. So those are housed there. MDL could host transcriptions, but it wouldn't, their platform wouldn't allow for any of the enhancements that we really wanted that would make this collection not just available online, but, you know, none of us want to create like a year 2001 collection where it's like, congratulations, you have 90,000 PDFs, go for it. You like, this has to be accessible. This has to be discoverable. So, you know, a lot of projects have been having some real success housing their collections at Omeka or then Omeka S. And so we worked with the developer, Annalise Daner. And so that's our main home base for the project. CWRGM.org is where you can see the digitized file. You can get to all the metadata. You can get to the transcriptions. You can get to the tags. You can see the annotations, all of those features. And again, you know, it also lets us house things like our lesson plans and all sorts of other things. I think, you know, if I could kind of take this opportunity to just kind of share kind of some lessons we've learned, is that I think one of the benefits really of working with y'all at From the Page is that we're able to bring these partners together, right? Annalise Daner, our developer, who's fantastic, you know, the Brumfields, Elizabeth LeBeau, who heads Mississippi Digital Library, you know, all getting in these meetings to talk about things. Well, if the metadata is stored here, but we need to refresh it over here, you know, what are some efficient ways where we can really automate that and get this done? And so, you know, just to kind of praise y'all, Ben and Sarah, just that ability to say, okay, this is what's not working. This is what we need to be able to fix. How can we do this in an efficient manner across these kind of multiple platforms, right? Because we want it as perfect as it can get at CWRGM.org, because that's where it's housed. We do not have a print edition. Everything will be there. But, you know, MDL has been a partner from the beginning. They have every right to want to have some of that there, right? And so absolutely, you know, and they're absolutely our partner who's hosting all of these image files. So it's this way that lets us kind of foster these partnerships while also ensuring that these collections are going to be really, really useful, not just for expert users who know how to navigate these things, but for non-experts who might be, you know, in a K through 12 classroom, or, you know, just an 8th grade student who wants to get into this stuff, or just a general kind of Joe Public researcher interested in genealogy, anything like that, so that we can really make these collections available.
Great. Thank you. Laura, can you talk about a little bit about publication venues or plans for publication?
Sure. We actually recently launched our digital edition platform. We are very lucky to have several partners, and I agree that having From the Page as a partner is tremendously helpful as we navigate all of the different outcomes of this work. So one of our founding partners is the Center for Digital Editing at the University of Virginia, and they have been working for years on a Drupal platform for documentary editions. And so they have provided our platform, and they have included us in a Mellon-funded digital publishing cooperative. So we have a platform that is for the Julian Bond papers that is customizable for all of our needs. We can make the images and the transcriptions and the linking. work for the type of content we have. And then in the future, I think we will also share some sort of keywords, possibly other linking behavior with some of the other clients in the cooperative, so that there will be kind of contextual cross-pollination. You'll be able to see if Bond mentions someone that perhaps Clarence Mitchell papers also mention, and look at the content that way. That's sort of the goal. So we have really wonderful and rich opportunities with that partnership. And then the other partnership we have is with the UVA Special Collections and archive systems there. They help us create our digital images. And once our student apprentices do the actual image creation, but then we share those images with the UVA library technology staff, and they create IIIF images so that the library has long-term access and storage and stable storage of these images. And then we actually link out to those. So the user experience on our platform doesn't show that partnership, but the images are being stored for the long term in the University of Virginia archive. So it's really very beneficial. All of these relationships are very beneficial for us and for sustainable content, so that maybe we don't have to do this for another 100 years.
That would be lovely.
Yeah.
So, Jack and Sue, I know that unlike the other projects we're talking with, you have multiple volumes that are already published in books, on paper, on shelves in research libraries, and all over the place. What's next for the digital side of things in terms of publication?
Well, this has been an ongoing process. We've had some false starts, and so we've explored lots of different ways to try to reach a digital audience. Maybe Sue, I think you might be the person better able to describe maybe the cautionary tale that we have about doing this.
Yeah, the challenge has been creating a workflow that reflects pretty much a hybrid process. We have both print, we have published. We don't actually have like a control file for all of the documents, which many projects do have. We don't have an inventory. So by collecting the documents, we're trying to create the closest thing to an inventory. There's so much work going on Douglas, not just within the digital edition, not just this project that Jack represents, but universally. And there are a lot of people transcribing Douglas. And I think the hope is what we provide is kind of the comprehensive edition. Like Mississippi, we are building a pipeline that takes things from the page and then goes into Omeka S. Omeka S is just a much nicer user interface because of the filtered searching, the way in which you can search subsets of documents. And I don't mean to diminish what From the Page does, but it's a very different kind of interface. Excuse me. So that's a kind of a complicated pipeline when you're thinking about newly transcribed documents plus previously published, and you've got to get the previous published documents into that pipeline. So we have no fewer than 3 workflows trying to get documents all at the final stage at the relative sort of same level of completion. We are talking right now with actually, I saw that Laura and Algie is on the call from folks at the Library of Congress, and they're from crowdsourcing platform to see if we can create a partnership there to help leverage what their community is transcribing with what we're doing, because it makes no sense for us to get LC stuff transcribed on From the Page that's also being transcribed on the Library of Congress site. So we're
Don't waste volunteers' time.
That's right.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm hearing, and if you've been on calls with me, you hear me say this a lot, but this concept of a system of record for different types of things. So a lot of people are using, digital library systems for system of record for images and metadata. And we try very hard at From the Page to be the system of record for transcription and some of the subject linking for some people, but not for everyone. And then you have a kind of a final publication system. And if I picture, a ball being passed down a field, and your kind of different stages of a pipeline for each of those represents.
So the last couple of questions have been pretty highly technical, and I kind of wanted to get back to Black History Month. These three projects all focus on Black history, but I can't help noticing that all the presenters at this webinar are white. So how are your projects involving, inviting more participation and more collaboration with Black scholars and Black communities? And I guess we'll just keep going back and forth, so we can start with the Douglas papers.
The Douglas papers actually started by John W. Blassingame, who was kind of an eminent African-American historian in the 1970s. And unfortunately, he died in the year 2000. Turned the project over to me in 1994, and so I have a long history doing this. I'm a member of the Africana Studies program in my school and also in previous universities. So we have a significant amount of interaction. The courses that I teach, I actually use the Douglas papers for something called the History Lab, which recruits Africana Studies and history students to come in and do a hands-on experience with Douglas documents. Another thing we do in our project is it's called Hoosiers Read Frederick Douglass Together. We sponsor public participation readings of our documents. This actually got started in Massachusetts, but we borrowed the idea here in Indiana, and so we take our documents to the public, into schools, into historical sites. And that's a way for us to reach the broader community of people who might be interested in the historical record of Frederick Douglass.
Great.
Thanks. Laura?
I want to thank you for raising this topic. I'm really glad to have an opportunity to talk about it. And the most important thing I can say about this is I am not the leader of this project. I am the managing editor. Our project director is Professor Deborah McDowell. She's a preeminent literature scholar in African American studies. And we have a board of historians and literary scholars in African American studies. And our home at the University of Virginia is in the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African and African American Studies. So I am not the leader of this project, and I am not the face of this project. The reason I am here is because Black History Month is busy and professors need to be here. So it's very important that this project is led by Black scholars. This is the story. This is a Black man's life story, his content, his work. I am here to serve this project. And in fact, I think that this project always needs to have a Black director. I don't have any aspirations to be the primary leader of this project. My role is to keep the trains moving. And also, I also need to have done my homework. So I do have a PhD in Black narrative and African American personal narrative. And I have digital publishing experience that I hope serves this project. But the truth is, not to be too West Wing, I serve at the pleasure of my director. I think that that's very important. So the leadership is not mine. And I also think it's really important that this project does not primarily profit me or any white-centered space in UVA. It needs to be in the African American Studies department. That was important to Bond himself when he was at the University of Virginia. So I don't see my work as inviting the Black community. I see my work as serving this scholarly community.
Thank you.
Great.
Susannah, Lindsey, you want to address that with the Mississippi project?
Yeah, so really from the beginning, the fact that we insisted on, this just wasn't just going to be Civil War era documents, this was going to be Civil War and Reconstruction era documents, was grounded in the fact that in a state where over 50% of the population is African American, during the Civil War, that meant almost 100% of the Black population was enslaved. If you want to tell the story of this era and understand it through the experience of people who lived it, you're going to have to include Reconstruction era documents, in part because that is the only time you're going to start to hear from African American writers themselves. The question, sorry, yeah, never mind. Ignore the dogs, they're lovely. A couple of things happened though along the way. Lindsey, I'm going to mute myself. Will you talk about Luster Company and also hiring practices?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've done a couple of different things to try and increase like the visibility and accessibility of African American voices in our collection. One of those is we have tried efforts to hire diverse groups of student researchers to provide those opportunities. That's something that's ongoing and has been in process, and we're still kind of struggling with. But we, thanks to connections that Ben and Sarah have given us, we have been doing recent work that was encouraged by NHPRC to check and see how accessible our site is actually for Black users. So we've done a lot of research and work on decolonizing the terminology that's in our collection. So, the subject terms that we use, we try to, do people first terminology, et cetera. But we've recently partnered with the Luster Company, which is directed by Dominique Luster, and she's currently helping us. This is very much in progress. We just started. She's helping us to test those features and test those terms and get more feedback and more conversations with Black users of the site. That also led us to, we recently met with the Memphis chapter of AUGS, the Afro-American History and Genealogical Society. And so we met with them and had the people present kind of test the website and tell us what they want and what they're looking at. So we're trying to create more spaces for conversation and ensure that we have kind of diverse partnerships and groups of people working on the project. And so that's been one of our main focuses this last year and into the future. We've always been dedicated to it, but we're really kind of ramping up efforts in that regard.
That's
Thanks.
cool.
Yeah. So similar subject, all of these projects are dealing with race in different ways, and they're dealing with documents that mention and grapple with race, or sometimes just blithely, do all kinds of things around this. You're running public projects, both via publication and via inviting the public to help do this work. Your documents themselves, how do you deal with the fact that you have, mentions of racism, terminology, actual racism, Confederate letters and things like that? How do you communicate that with your volunteers, and how do you kind of address that?
I think we'll start with Mississippi again.
Yeah.
Go backwards.
Yeah, do you want to go, Susannah?
Okay.
The dogs are silent now. No, but Lindsey, go ahead. You were gonna talk about subject tagging, and then I can talk about some of the other things.
Sure. I'll just briefly say one of the, important things to us is to transcribe the language that appears in the documents. But one of the cool things about subject tagging is you can then link it to more inclusive terminology and sometimes more accurate terminology. So when students, for example, look at documents at our website and they describe what is an act of lynching, but is not described like that in the letter, you see the verbatim transcription, but when you hover over it, you see, you know, that this is an act of lynching. You understand what that is. You understand kind of that context for it. And so that's been one of our ways of navigating that language, that often very violent racist language that pops up in our documents. But I'll turn it over to Susannah.
You know, and it's a great question, you know, Ben and Sarah, because you know, we would talk about, for example, in some of our very early public events, you know, we really launched the project with funding during COVID, during shutdown. So a lot of these were on Zoom. But it was a great way to talk to people about, you know, why you want to transcribe these documents verbatim, but also to help people understand what they're going to be running into as you do it. And so we really did that through a lot of kind of public events that we recorded. We placed these videos at the website. But the other place that it might be worth discussing that we ran into this is, you know, a lot of our original metadata is drafted off of calendars that were created at the state archives in the 60s and the 70s. And you'll find very outdated terminology that was more acceptable during that time in Mississippi. And so just working with the students to understand how to update some of that language. Even things like, for example, the U.S. forces, the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy would be described as the enemy, you know, updating some of this, you know, so it basically can happen at kind of these multiple stages. But I do agree with you. I mean, it's a challenging thing and something that's important for projects to be addressing and to have kind of a policy on how they want to address it.
Thank you. Laura?
So we're in an interesting situation with our documents because, well, our documents don't sometimes talk about race. Julian Bond talks specifically about the problem of race in America as his primary subject. And so our documents are actually a source of education themselves in these areas. So for the early years, that is our experience, is transcribing and working with these documents teaches us, the transcriber, our students, me, anyone using them, a lot of what your question gets at. Now we are preparing for, you know, as we move out of the speeches into correspondence, we're expecting that when we're working with people talking to Julian Bond, that we might end up with different material. And so what we're learning is this is a conversation that's happening right now. And there seems to be a developing set of best practices for how to handle some of these things. And it does help that my content is in the 20th century, not earlier. So we're preparing for how to manage some of these problems, but we haven't faced them yet in the way that I think you're asking the question.
Okay, thanks. Frederick Douglass papers?
Yeah, it's an interesting problem. You know, I guess we could fall back to the original philosophy of reproducing everything verbatim, and we have encountered students who have some reluctance to reproduce some racist language, and of course no student is required to do that. We have a discussion, and then usually we say we can understand the sensitivity to the issue, and usually we do it ourselves, because, you know, it's our goal to reproduce those documents as Douglass, not as he wrote them, but as people wrote to him with that language in that, or as he quotes other people. But it's a kind of our obligation to the historical record to reproduce those things accurately. Now, when it comes to kind of the metadata, or the what we used to have introductions in printed volumes, we've always attempted to be sensitive to these issues. We actually 40 or more years ago had an editor, had a member of our editorial board resign because he didn't like the use of the word African American. He said, I spent my whole career getting the word Negro spelled correctly. I'm not going to shift to your 20th century language. So this is an evolving issue and will probably continue to evolve long beyond our work in these editorial projects.
Wow. So we have 4 minutes left, which might be time enough for one question. So if there's any questions, please either type them in the meeting, or you can, at this point, you could just unmute yourself and shout something quickly.
If our projects want to drop into the chat links to their publication sites or their crowdsourcing projects, we'll include them in the email we send out at the end as well. I also put a link to a recent newsletter we published on thinking about how to handle racism and racist terminology in crowdsourcing projects. But somebody ask our speakers a question, please. They just gave us an hour of their time, so we really appreciate that.
I have a question, actually. My name is Rachel. I'm from Harvard University. I work in resource sharing at Harvard Depository, and I'm new to the organization, but I've done transcribing via for oral histories. So should I plan to start after the crowdsourcing presentation on the 23rd, I believe, or should I start? Can I start ahead of time? Like, what's the preference?
We do presentations all the time. You should schedule a call and we'll brainstorm together what the right approach is for your specific project. We love having those conversations. And I'll take a note on who you are, and I'll send you an email afterwards.
Okay.
I
have a question.
Right.
My name's Bob Rosenberg. I was at the Thomas Edison papers for a couple of decades. I left 20 years ago, but we had digitized quite a bit at that point. You editors, everybody on the panel, have the tremendous benefit of all these projects that have done wonderful stuff. One of the things that was most striking to me about the insularity of American scholarship was a meeting I went to in the 90s when digitization was really taking off. And a group of people from Germany were digitizing the Auschwitz archive. And they talked about security and how there were people who would attack and alter documents. And they had to have this extra level of security. And those of us from the States were pretty staggered by that. But now you guys are working in what could be called a charged atmosphere sometimes. And I'm sure they, whoever they are getting more sophisticated. Have any of you had any problems like that with security of your documents or transcriptions?
First. Speakers?
We have not, but I would imagine, I mean, Laura, I don't know, and Jack, I don't know if you all want to do.
We haven't had any problems. We're very fortunate that our Julian Bond's collection is primarily unified and in the hands of the University of Virginia. So we're also only now going public. So I don't expect problems with physical documents. I do wonder, given the charged atmosphere of the United States right now, what kind of attention we might receive just for working on this content and producing it. But
the German scholars were talking about their digital edition.
Yeah, so I actually think we can address some of that. We can't address your publication venues because you run those yourself. But I know, Laura, before you even were hired by the Bond Project, some of the very first Transcribe-a-thon, there were some concerns that people would, leave comments on pages that were the equivalent of I don't know, graffiti or other kind of of things. And so one of the things we did is we made it possible for people who ran projects to be able to delete any comments that are left at the bottom of any page. One of the other things that we have in place for From the Page, and we look at on a very regular basis, is we look for spam, but really it's for links out to things that are inappropriate. And so we have patterns that try to catch mostly just links, because we have seen some problems. University of Texas at Austin has occasionally had some spam come into their instance of From the Page that they run themselves. But we look at this all the time, and we have never had a problem on it. Like occasionally we have comment problems where transcribers argue with each other or get offended by each other, right? Because transcribers take this work so seriously. But we haven't had malicious.
Yeah, and that doesn't just, so far, we have not had that. That does not just apply to projects dealing with race. We also host the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's projects, and so far, have not encountered it.
But we try to stay on top of it, and we try to be very responsive. So if anything like that ever happens, and of course we have pretty good security on our website and our servers. We have a great sysadmin who's very security conscious. So there's a lot of things that are happening under the covers that you never noticed, because hopefully we never have problems. One, and two, we're so good at managing it, you wouldn't even notice it if we did. Yeah.
But we are just past time. Thank you, Bob, for that question. Thank you, all panelists. We really appreciate this. Your willingness to share your expertise and share your projects. This has been really fantastic. So thank you very much.
Thank you.